so fast.
All right.
Yes, your
Attention.
Attention. I'm Kermit Marsh, and this is generally Yeats politics and other things, and some of my thoughts that how I have, can relate to some of the things. So generally it's based on his politics and his other facets of his life. How can I, that girl standing there, my attention fix on Roman or on Russian or Spanish politics, yet here's a traveled man that knows what he talks about. And there's a politician then has read and thought, and maybe what they say is true of war and war's alarms. But oh, that I were young again and held her in my arms. The poet Yeats was a bundle of indescribable complexities and emotions. And why would he be interested in politics when the emotion of love is more powerful than all? He is spellbound by that girl standing there and all the others he has met. Yeats was a lover of all for all of his days. His preference was youth, beauty, and love. It's impossible to separate Yeats' politics and all the many facets of his life. To claim to understand Yeats' life and his career in one semester and to explain it in 1/3 of an hour would be extremely presumptuous of me. I relate to Yeats in many ways. I believe that women are the most magical of all God's creations. And women are partners with God in the creation of human life. Most surely with his strong emotional attachments, Yeats would have felt the same. His love and attachment to women and his love of nature, of Sligo, and of the Irish countryside were strong influences on his writing, and probably they were the strongest. Schiller, Hegel, Marx, modernism, modernity, nationalism, fascism, communism, authoritarianism, liberalism, socialism, Nazism, individualism, collectivism, and all the others. To speak of the political aesthetics of Yeats, we must first know the language. The author of the book that this was based on, the reference that I use mostly, was Michael North. He was writing about the politics of Yeats and Eliot and Pound. But he made a statement that Eliot could probably tell us more about the literary critic Lukács, as Lukács could tell us about him, about Eliot. The historians and critics bring out all the boxes and make an attempt to put Yeats into all of them. And being a complex man that he was, there were parts of Yeats that would fit comfortably in most of them. I prefer one big box marked poet. And William Butler Yeats was a poet and a good one. And all the facets of his life influenced his writing. Yeats was a nationalist. He believed in freedom. Freedom from, not freedom of. It was freedom of British rule. He felt contrast between the crowded London streets and the simple life of Sligo. He viewed British society as communal and collectivist. He viewed Irish society as individualist. In a big city, a man knows only the people like himself. But in Sligo, every man one meets is a class. Yeats sees England as a place where people are isolated, and he sees Ireland as a paradise. He believes in the rule of opposites. He believes in contrast. He strove to merge the two opposites. Yeats was appointed to the and he served 2 terms in the Irish Assembly. The conflicts and the contrast were in full display there. One of his main arguments in the Assembly concerned abortion. He was a strong advocate of family values, yet he argued the case on the side of abortionists. A passion for creative process is a passion I share with Yeats. Yeats did poetry with words. I do poetry in stone. Words are pure gold. Architecture is the mother of the arts. Architecture was caught up in the movement of aesthetic modernism. The works of Corbusier and Gropius are examples of the movement. Gropius' Bauhaus changed the face of architecture for all time. The right brain, left brain concept is alive. The imaginings and dreams of the right balance the logic and reason of the left. This concept reflects the contrast of Yeats' world and his reconciling the opposites. Yeats struggled with the contrast. To return to England, as with a prodigal son, to return to the house of the fathers, and with the rugged self-reliance of Thoreau and Walden Pond, he struggled to reconcile the 2 concepts. I will rise and go now and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin built there of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have, a hive for the honeybee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade. I shall have the same peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the veils of the morning to where the cricket sings. There midnight is all a glimmer, and the noon purples glow, and even evening full of the linnet's wings. I will arise and go now, for always, night and day, I hear the water lapping with the low sounds by the shore. While I stand by the roadway and on the pavement gray, I hear it in the deep heart's core. Innisfree is an island on the lake, and the lake itself is an island. Innisfree is an island within an island. I stand on the roadway and hear the water lapping in my heart's deep core. This is a tip of the hat to Thoreau. Yeats was a nationalist. He was conflicted. He was not an activist. He had said he didn't want his politics to influence his writing. His women were more deeply involved in politics than he. Maud Gonne was an Irish revolutionary. She and Yeats had a long-term romantic relationship. She was his muse and the inspiration of many of his poems. Maud Gonne married Major John McBride, who was he was active in the nationalist movement. And Yeats married Georgie Hyde Lees, and they had 2 children. But Georgia she was an attractive woman, and she was only about half his age. She was 25, and he was twice that age. So that was the young beauty that he was, and she was an attractive woman, and so was Maud Gonne. But Yeats was a good-looking man. So Yeats and his women were part of the beautiful people. It's been said that the battle for the national movement was not about religion. It was about territory. And I think the religion was involved in the Church of England and the Roman Catholics. They were at each other. But more than the religion and probably more than territory, it was about culture. The culture in Sligo, primarily where Yeats was was just completely different than the England that he kept wanting to return to, and he did. But it was a contrast there, and he fought the whole life on everything, both sides of every issue, and trying to bring them all together. This is they probably could have resolved their differences and could have given most of the things that the Irish movement wanted without completely separating, but that's just the way it was. It was a culture thing, and they didn't want to bring them together, even though that was one of Yeats' primary things, was to merge these two different, the opposite cultures. That was the way he lived his life. And I'm reminded of these kinds of culture things happen throughout history, and like in our revolution, the American Revolution, there were probably as many people who were empire loyalists as there were who wanted to separate. And my wife's ancestors, for instance, they were empire loyalists, and when the war came, they fled to Canada and stayed there until just before Flagler bought the railroad into Florida, and they moved back in the early part of this century. And a similar thing happened in the Mideast with Islam. They were the height of civilization back 400 or 500 years ago, but they were stay-at-home people. They did not travel, and the European culture, they did trade all over the world and left Islam behind, and they were very hesitant, the Islamists, to accept the Western ways, and they realized they had to make some progress, but they were accepting the military. They were losing all the military technology, and they would adopt some of those techniques, but it was a culture thing they didn't. It's like they would not westernize, but will modernize. So they were playing with words. And it's just an example, they accepted some of the military technology with with the weaponry and that sort of thing. But when it got to like changing the uniforms, it's like, no, that's culture. My uniform is culture. I can't change that. I'll accept the weapons, but I won't accept the culture. And eventually, not too long ago, back first part of the last century, the Ottoman Empire died, and they're still in the Middle Ages in their culture right now. Yeats died in Menton, France in January 1939, and after a private funeral, he was buried in Roquebrune, Cap Martin. And according to his wife, George, his request was, if I die, bury me there, and then in a year or so, after the newspapers have forgotten me, dig me up and plant me in Sligo. 19 years later, in 1948, Yeats' remains were removed to Drumcliff County, Sligo. Irony of ironies, the man in charge of the operation for the Irish government was Sean MacBride, son of Maud Gon MacBride. And Sean was a minister of the External Affairs. Yeats' epitaph is from lines from under Ben Bulben, which is one of his last poems. Cast a cold eye on life and on death, and the horseman passed by. May his soul and the soul of all the faithful departed, through the mercy of God, rest in peace. I'm done.
Okay.
Questions?
Anybody have any questions? All right, you're off the hook. Okay, so just take a quick minute to set something up.
right, so just while I wait for this to load up, the reason, as Kermit noted, Yeats's politics are extremely complicated and not entirely consistent with any particular ideology. And they tend to shift a bit throughout his lifetime as well. But one of the reasons why I wanted to think about political influences on Yeats's work, particularly as we look at this late phase of his career, this has to do with the fact that he's writing at the end of his, when Yeats is born, the British Empire is the great world power, right? It's the empire in which the sun has never set. The sun never sets. He's born at the height of the Victorian era. And by the time he dies in 1939, that empire that has underwritten so many of the cultural assumptions in many of these texts that we've read is cracking up. Are you okay?
I'm fine.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. Okay, so, right, where was it? Empire cracking up, right? Ireland by 1939 is already out. And the British are losing their grip on other places as well, right? By 1947, I think, India and Pakistan would become independent nations. And they hold on to African territories a little bit longer, but by the late 1960s, most of that's gone as well, right? So we see over the course of Yeats's career the disintegration of one of the big political powers of the 19th century. And I think, as Kermit noted as well, the Ottoman Empire in the East also breaks up just after the First World War. So we're looking at a different unit of cultural organization starting in the early 20th century, right? Empires by that point have largely had their day. And people are beginning to think of themselves as citizens of smaller national units, often emphasizing the differences between, say, what makes one Irish and what makes one English. Even within Ireland, right, there's a huge difference between the frequently idealized, right, the west of Ireland, places like Sligo, where Yeats is buried, and where his imaginative home arguably is, and between Dublin, the busier trading city in the east, facing England, right, which was also the seat of British administration within Ireland. So this is why I think it's worth thinking about Yeats as a political creature, as a political animal, right? He directly participates in the politics of the new Irish Republic as a member of a body called the Seanad. Now, the Seanad is, surprise, surprise, the Irish Senate. And it functions a lot more like, say, the House of Lords does in the British Parliament than our Senate does, right? Our Senate is supposed to be a sort of check on the impulses of the more populist House of Representatives, right? Legislation in our system has to pass through both houses before it goes to the president's desk. The Seanad in Ireland isn't really a strong legislative body. It's not elected for the most part. Most of its members are appointed. Yeats was an appointed senator, for example, yeah.
Yeah, it was, yeah, that was my question.
Mhm.
It was, they said he was appointed. Is that,
Yeah.
I mean, was that true of
Yeah.
all of it? I
Oh,
wondered-
yeah.
I wondered why that was, and I couldn't find anything.
Yeah, most members of the Shanad are appointed. I think the only members who are elected are representatives for the various constituent campuses of the National University of Ireland. And they're elected by graduates of those universities. Right, each university gets a seat in the Senate.
Is that still the same today?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's not,
Yeah. But Yeats is appointed. And he really only concerns himself when he's in the Senate with cultural matters. His biggest accomplishment as a senator, for example, is to decide on how the new coinage is going to look, right? He helps to commission the artist who designs the new Irish currency, since they would no longer be on the British pound. That's probably the most consequential political decision he makes. But he also makes a very well-known speech in defense of the minority population within Ireland that he belongs to. And this is really strongly indicative of the direction his political thought takes towards the end of his life. One of the big concerns that a lot of Irish Protestants had when the Free State of Ireland was formed was that in a majority Catholic state, they would no longer enjoy some of the rights they had enjoyed as British citizens. For example, the right to contraception, right, which most Protestant traditions are more or less okay with, but the Catholic Church decidedly is not. So Yeats gets up and describes his own people, the Anglo-Irish, as no petty people, and goes on to list a number of their cultural accomplishments, right? He develops this sort of pantheon of Anglo-Irish figures, mostly from the 18th century, whom he regards as his own political, philosophical, and artistic forebears. So that, yeah, Katie.
Is that why he was so concerned with culture? Was because of the Anglo-Irish?
Well, you know, he's deeply concerned with culture from the beginning of his career. And I think a lot of it has to do, like, some of the direction of his cultural concerns, I think, is related to his membership in this particular group, right? When we look, for example, at the cultural nationalism of his early work, right, when he's bringing in all of that Celtic myth, what he's looking to do there, and I think we talked about this a little bit, what he's looking to do there is turn back the clock to a time before different Christian sects had their division, right? So it's like, hey, this is a shared heritage that we can all agree on, right? We're all Irish, whether we're Catholic or Protestant, so we all think that Caholen is pretty damn great, right? We all thrill to the deeds of the Fianna and all of that shit. But he develops a much more chauvinistically Anglo-Irish sense of culture as he gets older. And this is reflected in some of his symbolism. But it's mostly reflected in the figures that he chooses as, you know, his sort of, he sort of sets up his own, like, the little household gods, right? So the figures that he regards as most important for his own intellectual and spiritual development are Edmund Burke, Jonathan Swift, George Berkeley, and there's one I'm forgetting. Who the hell is it? Let's see, they're all in that one poem.
Goldsmith?
Yes, Oliver Goldsmith. Thank you. Yeah, these are Yeats's four main figures. Do you recognize any of these names? What do you know about any of these people?
A modest.
Okay, Jonathan Swift, right? A Modest Proposal. Yep. A short pamphlet, which advances the argument that since the British landlords have already eaten the parents of Irish children, they may as well eat the children as well. So Swift works primarily in what literary mode? What does he do?
Satire.
Exactly, yes, he's a satirist. That was all disturbingly unified. Satire. And Yeats sort of traces his attitude towards the general run of humanity back to Jonathan Swift, right? How many of you have read Gulliver's Travels or any part of Gulliver's Travels? Okay, good. Now, how many of you remember the part at the end of the book where Gulliver is marooned on that island full of intelligent talking horses?
No.
Right?
How could we forget?
Yes. How could any of us, right?
Like I just hear Dr. Waldron in my head going, Wenham!
Oh, wrong.
All right. Anywho, the island is also inhabited by filthy ape-like creatures called yahoos, right? And these yahoos represent the common run of humanity, right? Yeats has similar attitudes towards the ordinary grasping person, right? There's, the yahoos have this characteristic, right? They're obsessed with shiny things, and they will dig into the earth to get shiny things, and then we'll bury them, and we'll kill other yahoos who try to take their shiny things. Yeah. Anywho, that's the one of the same sort of impulses that Yeats tends to condemn, right? That mercantile grasping impulse. Now, what about any other names here that you guys recognize? Do you know any of these other figures?
Burke sounds familiar, but I can't name.
Okay. Yeah.
That sounds vaguely familiar.
Okay, Burke, is a conservative political philosopher. Best known today for a short book called Reflections on the Revolution in France. And Burke defends the old French regime largely on aesthetic grounds. Right? The chivalry and pageantry of aristocracy to him is preferable to what he sees as the ugliness of what he would call mob rule, right? Now, Yeats, in his own political formulations, right, the only two classes of people Yeats has any real use for are aristocrats and peasants. Whom he sees existing in this kind of happy symbiosis, right? The good and kind landlord rules over his little fiefdom, and the peasants are happy and prosperous, and they sort of form this, happy little feudal ecosystem, right? Essentially, if you want to define Yeats's politics in any particular box, he's more a feudalist than he is anything else. He likes aristocrats. He likes peasants, at least theoretically. Although he probably wouldn't recognize a real peasant if one walked up and bit him on the ass. What he disdains are, like so many other high modernists, those vulgar middle classes. The very people who tend to come into power when a democratic regime is established, right? Aristocracy gets toppled. These dirty, grasping middle classes who like digging up shiny things and holding on to them are the people who tend to take over. And one of the things he dislikes about the middle classes comes from Burke, right? He doesn't like their aesthetics. He tends to regard bourgeois aesthetics as vulgar, right? These are people who have no appreciation for art, people who have no appreciation for the finer things. You need an aristocrat to understand that. Now, what about these other figures, Berkeley and Goldsmith? Do these names ring a bell for anybody? They're ringing a very, very small, quiet bell. Okay, so Goldsmith is another writer. Goldsmith is an 18th century poet and playwright. Best known for a poem called The Deserted Village. Okay.
Yes, we did.
Yeah, we got that.
The one
Okay.
that went to the big city and got tempted with sin.
Sin.
Yes.
Okay, so we did The Deserted Village in Restoration, I guess, 18th century.
Poor people don't sin. It's basically it.
Yeah.
Farmers don't sin.
It is a real kind of canonization of rural village life, right? Now, Berkeley is the one I'm going to guess is least familiar to any of you. And Berkeley is kind of a niche interest, and it's kind of weird that Yeats gets interested in this guy. But did you notice that there's a particular Greek philosopher that Yeats mentions a lot in these late poems?
Plato.
Yeah, Plato pops up kind of a lot here. Anybody know what the basis of Plato's philosophy is? I think we may have gone over this before, but refresh my memory.
No, he's not the one who hated poetry, right? That would be.
Actually, well, it's not that he hated poetry. He thought that poetry was actually a beautiful and wonderful thing, but that poetry was politically dangerous and should be banned
Okay, no.
from the ideal republic. And in part because poetry is an imitation of actions, right? And actions are themselves imitations of ideas. Everything in the visible world is an imitation of some ideal form that exists in a world that we can't quite access.
Isn't it like when we were talking about Tar on that very last day, you were talking about
Mhm.
philosophical idealism? Is that kind of the same
Yeah,
thing?
Plato is probably the father of Western philosophical idealism. And that's why I bring him up here, because Berkeley has similar sorts of ideas, right? Just as Plato argues that the only things that are real are ideas, ideal forms, right? Berkeley argues that there is no such thing as material substance. Right? Matter doesn't exist. Only ideas exist. And so we're all having our own little subjective experience every time we sit down in this class, right? But there is no shared sense of matter. The only things that exist are ideas. If you want a rundown of Yeats's Gallery of Saints here, there's a good book. It's a little bit old now, but it's still pretty valuable. By a guy by the name of Donald Torchiana. It's called W.B. Yeats in Georgian Ireland.
What is his name?
Torchiana, Torchiana. So when we talk about the Georgian period, what we're talking about is the 18th century. Now for Yeats, right, our ex-cultural nationalist, this seems like a weird historical moment to build your altar to your ancestors upon, right? Because in the 18th century, this would have been the period over which British rule of Ireland was largely cemented. But what he longs for, what he doesn't see in his own time, is the greatness of these particular figures, or figures who are of the same stature of these individuals. And another thing to note about 18th century Ireland is that even though this is the period in which British rule was cemented, Ireland did have its own parliament, which voted itself out of existence in 1800. Now, this parliament was not really an elected body, and it was made up entirely of Anglo-Irish landlords who were mostly pursuing their own financial interests. But remember, these are the people whom Yeats largely sees himself coming from. And this is the class that largely didn't show up for the revolutions in 1916 and in 1921. So the revolutions that actually lead to the formation of an Irish free state are Catholic revolutions. Dominated by Gaelic Irish Catholics, and by Gaelic Irish I'm just trying to distinguish them from the Anglo-Irish. Most of them were not necessarily Gaelic speakers. So, in some sense, Yeats is trying to substitute his own group of gods for the group of revolutionary gods of that particular generation, right? And we can see him in some of these poems as well, attempting to bring in some of his own Anglo-Irish peers and set them up in a sort of similar position, right? So if we look at the Municipal Gallery Revisited on page 119. Around me, the images of 30 years, an ambush, pilgrims at the waterside, casement upon trial, half hidden by the bars, guarded, Griffith staring in hysterical pride, Kevin O'Higgins' countenance that wears a gentle, questioning look that cannot hide, a soul incapable of remorse or rest, a revolutionary soldier kneeling to be blessed. And then the Catholics disappear from the poem, right? These three individuals, Arthur Griffith, who was the president of the founder of the original Sinn Féin party, and Kevin O'Higgins, who was the Minister for Defense during the Irish Civil War. They're the last Catholics who get mentioned in the poem, right? We see this revolutionary soldier kneeling to be blessed, ostensibly by a priest. An abbot or archbishop with an upraised hand blessing the tricolor. This is not, I say, the dead Ireland of my youth, but an Ireland the poets have imagined, terrible and gay. Before a woman's portrait suddenly I stand, beautiful and gentle in her Venetian way. I met her all but 50 years ago, for 20 minutes in some studio. Maud Gunn. Heart smitten with emotion, I sink down, my heart recovering with covered eyes. Wherever I had looked upon my permanent or impermanent images. Augusta Gregory's son, her sister's son, Hugh Lane, only begetter of all these. Hazel Lavery living and dying, that tale as though some ballad singer had sung it all. Mancini's portrait of Augusta Gregory, greatest since Rembrandt, according to John Synge. A great ebullient portrait, certainly, but where is the brush that could show anything of all that pride and that humility? And I am in despair that time may bring approved patterns of women or of men, but not that self-same excellence again. My medieval knees lack health until they bend, but in that woman, in that household where honor had lived so long, all lacking found. Childless I thought, my children may find here deep-rooted things, but never foresaw its end. And now that the end has come, I have not wept. No fox can foul the lair the badger swept. An image out of Spenser in the common tongue. John Synge, I and Augusta Gregory thought all that we did, all that we said or sang, must come from contact with the soil. From that contact, everything Antaeus-like grew strong. We three alone in modern times had brought everything down to that soul test again. Dream of the noble and the beggar man. And here's John Synge himself, that rooted man forgetting human words, a grave, deep face. You that would judge me, do not judge alone, this book or that. Come to this hallowed place, where my friends' portraits hang and look thereon, Ireland's history and their lineaments trace. Think where man's glory most begins and ends, and say my glory was I had such friends. So, what he's describing in this poem is a walk through a portrait gallery full of portraits of this early generation of important figures in an independent Ireland, right? Or in the formation of an independent Ireland. Now, one thing to note about all the Protestant figures he mentions, with the exception of Maud Gunn, who was primarily an activist, an agitator, right? Lady Augusta Gregory, Douglas Hyde, John Synge, they're artists. The other Anglo-Irish whom he places in positions of prominence are artists and writers. So even if they weren't out fighting on the front lines, Yeats argues, their cultural contributions are important enough to merit their inclusion in this gallery of heroes. Now, there's another word here that is important that pops up in a lot of these late poems. And it has actually strong Nietzschean connotations, right? When he says on page 120, right, this is not, I say, the dead Ireland of my youth, but an Ireland the poets have imagined, terrible and gay. Now, what Yeats means by this particular word is a little bit idiosyncratic. It has nothing necessarily to do with what would have been the usual connotation of the word in that time of just sort of devil-may-care happiness, right? This is not, well, in either sense of the word Cole Porter gay. This is Nietzsche gay. This is a sort of defiant happiness, an antagonistic happiness. This is an insistence on remaining joyful in the face of some kind of, some oppression or some difficulty. Right? There's a line in, I think it's Lapis Lazuli, on page 115. All perform their tragic play. There struts Hamlet, there is Lear. That's Ophelia, that's Cordelia. Yet they, should the last scene be there, the great stage curtain about to drop, if worthy their prominent part in the play, do not break up their lines to weep. They know that Hamlet and Lear are gay, gaiety transfiguring all that dread. Right? That Hamlet and Lear, these tragic heroes in Shakespeare's plays, face up to the destiny that's waiting for them with something approaching joy. Right? We may have talked about this when we talked about Tar, because I know we've discussed Nietzsche before, but how many of you remember Nietzsche's idea of the eternal recurrence? How many of you are familiar with this? Eternal return or eternal recurrence? A couple of you are nodding. Somebody refresh my memory then. What is this all about?
Didn't we say that it was like it never gets better? It was one of the characters in Tar where like they keep going but it like nothing comes around, like they just keep going in this cycle and nothing ever gets better. They just keep repeating the same. It might not be the same people they encounter or something like that, but the same kind of people.
It's that test to see
Yeah.
if you imagine that you're falling
Yes.
and nothing ever gets better. What do you do?
Yeah.
Yes. Are you an Übermensch or are you not? Right? If you are the superior sort of person, even after you realize that you are stuck in this same oppressive situation forever and that nothing will change, you still embrace that situation with defiant joy. All right, this is the way things are going to be. I am strong enough within myself to handle this. If you are the normal type of, by Nietzschean standards, little wimpy person, right, then you are just going to start screaming your little head off and freaking out that, oh my God, this is never going to get better. So this is what Yeats is referencing here, right? That Hamlet and Lear know that things aren't going to get better and face up to their fates night after night. I mean, hell, a character in a play is actually a pretty great illustration of this concept, right? Because we know that that character's situation will never change. From night to night, it's always going to repeat. It's always going to happen the same way. How many of you have ever read Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead by Tom Stoppard or seen the play? I mean, that's the basic notion that this play riffs on, right? It's, taking these two minor characters from Hamlet who are trying to find their way out of that play and the obligations that that play imposes on them. But because that's not the way they're written, they can't, right? They can't avoid the fate that Shakespeare has already written for them. Neither can Hamlet and Lear in this situation. But they go towards it, they embrace it anyway. Now, there's one more thing to note here as well about Yeats's late style. Right, and I think Kermit touched on some of this when he sort of talked about Yeats's fixation on youth, and in particular, his very, very strong attractions, even into old age, to much younger women. Right, he married a woman who was half his age, and continued to have dalliances with other women who were much younger. And in fact, despite impotence as an old man. He underwent a procedure. It was basically just a vasectomy, but the quack doctor who sold it to him, a guy by the name of Steinach, claimed that doing so would sort of restore his potency and restore all of his mental and spiritual powers.
And he believed it, and it did.
Yeah, well, he believed it. Yeats, as we've already noted, was in some ways a little bit credulous. But yes, I mean, he underwent this operation to get back some of that lost what he felt was sort of lost vitality, right? And we can see an expression of that attempt to return to vitality in the physicality of some of these late poems. Right? You may remember a poem from the mid-period of Yeats's career called Sailing to Byzantium. Which is also a poem that's concerned about aging, but in a rather different way. So why don't we just return to that for a second, because it makes for a useful comparison. We'll find that on page 81. That is no country for old men. The young, in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations, at their song the salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish, flesh, or fowl, commend all summer long, whatever is begotten, born, and dies. Caught in that sensual music, all neglect, monuments of unaging intellect. An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul clap its hands and louder sing, for every tatter in its mortal dress. Nor is there singing school but studying, monuments of its own magnificence. And therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. So, in late middle age, Yeats's attitude towards the body is, this is a failing thing, right? The body is doomed to rot and to die. And so, what I need to do is abandon things of the body and focus on things of the intellect and find other ways to preserve myself, which he discovers in the second half of the poem. Right? O sages standing in God's holy fire, as in the gold mosaic of a wall, come from the holy fire, Pern and Agyre, and be the singing masters of my soul. Consume my heart away, sick with desire, and fasten to a dying animal it knows not what it is, and gather me into the artifice of eternity. Once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing, but such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make of hammered gold and gold enameling, to keep a drowsy emperor awake, or set upon a golden bough to sing to lords and ladies of Byzantium of what is past or passing or to come. So here, in the late 1920s, he's imagining himself as being sort of taken and made into a golden bird that will continue to sing forever, right? Artifice, right? Objects, created, crafted objects, these are the things that last as the body dies away. Now we see him then reversing this in the late poem Byzantium. If we look on page 108. The unpurged images of day recede. The emperor's drunken soldiery are abed. Night resonance recedes, night walker's song after great cathedral gong. A starlit or a moonlit dome disdains all that man is, all mere complexities, the fury and the mire of human veins. So what he wanted to do in sailing to Byzantium, right, is get rid of all that human physical complexity and be boiled down into a figure in a mosaic or, some sort of singing automaton, right? You turn its crank and it continues to sing its little song. Here, the starlit or moonlit dome disdains all that man is, right? The created object, the constructed object, has no humanity about it. The merely artificial object ignores the fury and the mire of human veins. Right? Emotion here, intense emotion, being connected to the body and things of the body. Before me floats an image, man or shade, shade more than man, more image than a shade. For Hades' bobbin bound in mummy cloth may unwind the winding path. A mouth that has no moisture and no breath, breathless mouths may summon. I hail the Superman. I call it death and life and death. Miracle, bird or golden handiwork, more miracle than bird or handiwork, planted on the starlit golden bough, can like the cocks of Hades crow, or by the moon embittered scorn aloud, in glory of changeless metal, common bird or petal, and all complexities of mire or blood. At midnight on the emperor's pavement flit flames that no faggot feeds, no steel has lit, nor storm disturbs, flames begotten of flame, where blood begotten spirits come, and all complexities of fury leave, dying into a dance, an agony of trance, an agony of flame that cannot singe a sleeve. So this is a return of physical feeling, right? Blood begotten spirits. An agony of trance, an agony of flame. Right, but fury and agony are good things. Fury and agony are positive things. Right? They show that you can feel again. Right? You melt your golden bird, you return to a physical body, dying though it may be, and you get your human feelings back. Those things that were taken from you when you just made yourself into art. A straddle on the dolphins, mire and blood, spirit after spirit. The smithies break the flood, the golden smithies of the emperor. Right, so here he is, he's imagining himself riding a wave, riding a dolphin on a wave that is itself smashing the workshops where these great works of art are made, right? The smithies where the golden bird is forged. I'm going to ride a dolphin straight on through him. Marbles of the dancing floor break bitter furies of complexity. Those images that yet fresh images beget, that dolphin torn, that gong tormented sea. So the overall attitude of the poem here, right, is to move away from artificiality, to move away from attempts to preserve one's life and preserve one's art and preserve what remains of one's personality, and just jump right back into sheer brute physicality. Right. The things of the spirit are more valuable when connected to the body. We see the same thing reflected in these various dialogues between self and soul, right? Dialogues between soul and heart. The physical body in these late poems tends to win out, which would not have been the case in the poems of Yeats's middle period, when he's really, really focused on his system of gyres and all that, right? When he's really focused on talking to bodiless spirits. So, I've been doing a lot of talking here. What questions do you guys have about any of this? about any of these poems at all?
Not about the poems, but his involvement with the occult.
Okay.
Was that waning, or was he still, practicing all this black magic?
Yeats continued to believe in weird things for the course of his lifetime. Yeah, I mean, he was perhaps less directly involved in any sorts of secret societies by the end of his life. Those were associations that by and large by middle age had petered out. And he was really more focused on the development of private systems like the one that Sarah and I both talked about when we discussed Yeats's sort of middle poetry. So that particular system actually sort of becomes a little bit less imaginatively important by the end of his career, but he never really disavows it. He just becomes less interested in talking to airy spirits. Perhaps, as he feels death approaching, right? And one thing we have to remember about Yeats too, in his last years, right? He dies in 1939, right? So he dies just before the outbreak of the Second World War. And when he's writing these last poems, there is this kind of palpable tension in European politics. We're going to see this drawn out a little bit more specifically in Louis MacNeice's Autumn Journal. But, by the time Yeats dies, there's been the Civil War in Spain, right? Hitler has been elected chancellor in Germany. Mussolini is in power in Italy. The Stalinists in Russia briefly make accommodation with the Nazis, right? The British give the Sudetenland.
And the winds of
To
war
the-
were.
Oh yeah, they're
Blowing.
blowing. They are blowing, yeah. This is something that's going to, there are all these measures that are being taken to stave it off, but there is a great deal of tension in there, and Yeats dies right in the middle of that. And he's writing up until the day he dies. I mean, what we have here is his last poems in this edition. I mean, these are poems that were published posthumously, right? These were what he was working on at the time of his death. And just, as I guess maybe a little sort of side note that we'll end with here, Kermit mentioned that Yeats's body was not repatriated in Ireland until 1948. That was actually because of conditions created by the war. Because of when he happened to die and where he happened to die, it wasn't until 1948 that they were actually able to bring his body home. And to bring MacNeice into this again, MacNeice suggested to a bunch of other people that the body they brought back was the wrong one. So there is a possibility that the man who is buried in William Butler Yeats's grave is not
So he may still
William
be in
Butler
France.
Yeats. He may very well still be in France, yeah.
Could still be alive.
The other weird thing,
Dyer's keeping him.
well, maybe he is somewhere in golden bird form, or perning in a gyre in some holy mosaic in
You
Istanbul.
never know.
But the other interesting thing about Yeats's burial plot, normally when, your spouse dies, right, they're buried beside you. Mrs. Yeats is buried at his feet with a much smaller marker in the Drumcliff churchyard in Sligo. It's strange, yeah.
One of the things that I read about her is, during the final days of his life, she made a comment to him that after you're dead, there's going to be all kinds of talk about your dalliances.
Uh-huh.
I will never say a word about it because you're the best. I mean, she was faithful.
Yeah, almost
until this day.
almost to a fault.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, most of what we know about Yeats's other dalliances come from his letters that are sort of published once his works become public domain. In fact, there's a guy, the first really good biography of Yeats is written by a guy by the name of Norman Jeffers. And yeah, Jeffers actually would bicycle to Mrs. Yeats's house outside of Dublin with bottles of her favorite whiskey. And she would then give him letters that he could then use to construct his biography of Yeats. All right, so I already mentioned, right, that I'm not going to be here next Wednesday. So you're going to be next week reading Vile Bodies by Evelyn Waugh. So we've got a few reading questions for you that you can take down. And remember, what we're going to be doing, right? You won't actually come here on Wednesday. You will just, do, say, like a 2-page, double-space, typed-up version of what your in-class writing would have been.
I have written down here that we're not meeting this week. Are we meeting this week and not next week?